So, many of you have heard of this term disruptive innovation, right? Here's a definition from Clayton Christensen, who coined the phrase. He's a guru at Harvard Business School. Disruptive innovation occurs when existing patterns of work, organization, and hierarchy are radically transformed in a relatively short space of time. And Christensen says it follows four kind of levels. First, you get new competitors in the marketplace. The existing competitors do what? Ignore them, mostly, or flee to higher ground, saying we didn't want to do that little work anyway. But what happens is the disruptors establish a foundation in the lower part and start moving their way up the market, and eventually you could get a flip in which their disruptive technology becomes the standard. We've seen this story many times in manufacturing, actually. Martha knows I often tell a story about Tower Records and digital music. I won't tell this one. The classic one is in computers, right? Anybody remember Digital Electronic Corporation or Wang Computers? Here's a hint. The only thing, yeah, you don't know them, okay? These were the most important computer companies in the world in the 1970s. By the 1980s or early 90s, they weren't just smaller, they were gone. And some of you may be old enough to remember the original personal computers were sold in the toy department, okay? They were gadgets. They had less power than your Texas Instrument calculator, remember that? Okay. The only one that survived, actually, and this is another story I'm not going to tell more except because IBM is important, is IBM, which decided this was important enough that they were going to, quote, disrupt themselves by creating a personal computing division, only they located it in Miami. It was secret. The people who ran the mainframes didn't know about it because they knew they would kill it if they could, okay? So, IBM is at it again, all right? How many of you have heard of the IBM Watson project? Just put your hands up, okay? That's good. I do this in lawyers with fancy lawyers. We just had right over there 40 managing partners and senior leaders from global law firms. Many of them had never heard about it. You probably first heard about it when it beat Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion in chess. Then it wasn't called Watson, it was called Big Blue, or Deep Blue. And then they realized that Deep Blue sounded a little bit too much like HAL on 2001 or The Matrix. And so then they said, no, we're going to call it Watson. What could be friendlier than Watson? But then they took on something turns out to be more difficult. Beating Garry Kasparov at chess, he's brilliant, not so hard. You figure out the first move in chess, you can program every other move there is, and then any computer eventually will be able to beat any human. But then it beat Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. And it turns out that's really hard because Jeopardy's done in ordinary language. You could ask about an infinite number of things. It's on a learning progression model. Remember the $20, $40, $60? Turns out that's really hard. When they beat Jennings in Jeopardy, the guy from the IBM Watson project who came and talked here a couple of years ago, and you could watch his talk on our website, said our phone started ringing off the hook. With who? Cancer doctors. Cancer doctors? First thing I said is, cancer doctors watch Jeopardy? Apparently so. But they also find themselves confronted with huge amounts of information in a language that's not X's and O's, that they have to figure out how to process and digest that no doctor can do. And so they started saying, if you could teach a computer to do that in Jeopardy, maybe you could do that to help me with the information from the Human Genome Project or what's being written in Chinese medical journals about discovery. And they first started thinking about diagnosis, and there's some amazing stories about this. Then they started thinking about discovery or research. They're using Watson to find new proteins to create new cancer medicines. And I'm talking Sloan Kettering, Mass General Hospital, Cleveland Clinic, MD Anderson, all the top hospitals in the world. And here's their future. They say, look, medicine is really complicated. It might be actually more like Jeopardy, but there's something that's more like chess. It's called law, game of rules, okay? And law turns out to be ripe for disruption. First, we live in the most conservative discipline in the world. We live in a discipline in the common law world in which you cannot say anything new until you absolutely prove someone said it before. Not exactly ripe for innovation, right? We've also been a heavily regulated business. Only guess who controls the regulation? Us. We decide on the requirements of who becomes a lawyer, admissions, standards of practice, expulsion. And we've had a bunch of very tight rules on competition and informal norms as well. But all these are breaking down. A whole nother TED Talk could be about what's happening in the UK, where law is becoming deregulated, essentially. You could have new organizational forms of practice, multidisciplinary practice. You could have companies owning law firms, new forms of capital. You could have external investment into law firms, even public ownership. And it's all being looked over not by lawyers, but by a competition regulator who has a very different view about what should happen. And this is revealing law's, let's say, new or old clothes. So what is law actually? Well, it's one part information. That can be digitized, data analytics. It's one part perspiration. You could send that to Bangalore or other low-cost labor environments. Well, we own this, right? One part inspiration. Well, in multidisciplinary, complex problems, who's to say who has the right inspiration to solve those problems? It's one part confirmation, which we're pathetic at, like how do you know it works, which is the rise of a bunch of objective metrics of quality and trust. And then it's one part remuneration. And here's where we've been really good. Law firms have some of the highest profit margins for businesses of their kind. And people are saying, hey, wait a minute. I can do that for half the price and still make money. And it's coming, right? We had a conference again on disruptive innovation. We had 4 different categories of disruptors. The biggest and most important, which we can talk about in question and answer, is people who try to provide ordinary legal services to people who can't afford them, which is, by the way, 80 or 90% of the population. Another ones are trying to use technology to streamline legal tasks. Others are using data analytics, pattern recognition, process management. Others are using matching networks. I'll come to this in a second, like eBay, putting lawyers together with people who need legal services. All of these things are attracting significant capital. All of them are being pushed further by things like third-party litigation funding, which I'm looking at one of the biggest experts in the world right over here, who's going to speak next. And all of them are being pushed by sophisticated legal consumers like general counsels who are being pushed to provide more for less. So where are we going? I heard the head of Expedia, who started Expedia. He started a new company in the legal services world called ABBA. And he says, you probably see their television commercials, and he says he has 3 simple laws. What can be known will be known, what can be rated will be rated, and what can be free will be free. Now, it turns out this is actually not true. I think all of those are false, and if the last one were true, he wouldn't be so rich. But the real question is, how do we measure value? Here's what lawyers say. We have 2 answers. 1, inputs, like credentials. Who produced it? Did they go to Harvard Law School? How many hours did it take to produce? But the more you know, the less you care about the input, and the more you care about the output as measured in value to you. That's where the whole world has been going. Our measure of output, actually Charles Fried knows this, is completely subjective. Like, I know it when I see it. To which I remind lawyers that if your measure of value is most commonly associated with the definition of pornography, you're in trouble, okay? But here's the thing, the disruptors haven't figured it out either. So I'm just gonna go through this very quickly because I'm already over my time. They've got a bunch of hammers looking for nails. IBM put 5 billion into the Watson project. And it's trying to figure out how to use it in this new space, right? They're looking for low-hanging fruit instead of where value is. So they're concentrating on things like legal research and document assembly. But eventually they'll realize there's much more important things you could use this technology for. They're equating everything that we say about distinctiveness as protectionism. But I don't think that's true, actually. I think there are things, lawyers are not like taxi cabs, which could be displaced by Uber drivers. Although, frankly, you should think more about Uber, too, okay? Too much Friedman, not enough Williamson. It means they really, really believe that the market will result, will fix everything. But we know the market doesn't produce all goods, and markets work through institutions. And they don't really understand legal institutions. And finally, they all talk about collaboration, but they're not collaborating with anybody. They're all working on their own trying to make money. So, really quick, what does this mean for Harvard Law School? I think we need to transfer from a world in which knowledge resides only in the heads of individual lawyers to one in which knowledge will increasingly reside in big sources of data that lawyers are going to have to learn how to use. We have to understand the increasing size and complexity of problems that lawyers are being asked to solve, which means we need to teach our students how to unbundle legal problems. But that means you have to collaborate across organizational boundaries with multiple providers. And here's the hard part, putting it all together again. Remember, it was easy to push Humpty Dumpty off the wall, and he was pushed, didn't just fall. But remember, all the king's horses and all the king's men. That's the biggest challenge going on today. How do we do this while preserving our core values? To accomplish this, we're going to have to work together across divides, including with the disruptors, which means we need all the members of our community, which is why I'm so happy to talk to you. Thank you.